Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. I'm Jesse Hirsh. Global warming has become one of the most pressing issues in our world. The environmental movement has grown and gained an important role in setting the priorities for politicians and social change. Global summits are being held to tackle climate change, and communities everywhere are involved in campaigns to save the Earth, including many religious communities who have become quite vocal in the struggle to curb global warming. Joining me in studio to discuss the role of religious communities in the environmental movement is Stuart Laidlaw, the faith and ethics reporter at the Toronto Star. Thanks for coming in today.
No problem.
Now, I would assume that there's generally quite a range of perspectives, religious communities being a very broad concept. What have you found in your research in terms of the way that religious communities are interacting with the environmental movement or becoming fully immersed and involved?
Well, you're right, it does range quite a bit. Sometimes a church or a faith community itself will be involved in an environmental movement. There's several United Church congregations, for instance, that are involved in the bottled water. They don't like bottled water, so they, are refusing to use it, or, using their congregational strength, money, people power, or whatever, to be actually involved themselves in the environmental movement. But also there's just people involved in other environmental groups such as Greenpeace or Council of Canadian, Sierra Club. They get involved with those groups in part because of their own religious feelings, that they feel that a call to do something with their faith and to give a bit back to the society, and they choose the environmental movement to do that, so that they're not their faith community itself may not be involved, but they are because of their faith.
And I would assume that builds upon traditions of social justice that you would see as part of the motivation for people being involved in social activism and equivalent groups. Is it relatively new that the environmental movement has been perhaps identified or linked towards that sentiment amongst religious communities?
It is relatively new that it's sort of been recognized, but it has been growing for quite a while. You're right, the social justice idea, it's a basic tenet of a lot of religions, is to take care of the poor, the disadvantaged in society. The definition of society has sort of expanded from being your own city, your own neighborhood, to being your province, your country, even the world. And so some of the early environmental activism of faith groups was towards specific incidents, such as a uranium mine and an effect it had on the environment and the nearby native communities, say. And that was seen as a social justice issue affecting a specific group. Same with, fish stocks being plundered, that sort of thing. And so you saw religious groups starting to get involved with that sort of thing, and then it expanded, like with the acid rain debates in the 70s and 80s, faith groups getting involved with that. Again, it was a very specific environmental problem, and in recent years it's been moving more into global warming as a big issue for environmental groups to get involved in.
Well, and obviously, global warming, without using a cliche, is a global issue. And I think you're seeing a lot more sort of multilateral efforts like the Kyoto Accord and, the UN Forum on Climate Change. Are religious communities participating at that level as well?
Yes. The growth of the global warming as a political issue with, the signing of the Kyoto Protocol sort of coalesced with the faith communities worldwide taking on the environmental issues. And for global warming, that came through the World Council of Churches, which was in Kyoto as an organized, recognized non-governmental organization. And they have been attending actually all of the post-Kyoto meetings on the protocol, and meeting just as long as the environmental or heads of state meet, debating the issues alongside them, and meeting with many of the leaders, political leaders who are at the meetings, and bringing a real faith perspective to it, and saying, reminding the political leaders that this isn't just an issue to be, part of horse trading.
Right.
There's something bigger here, that this is an important issue of right and wrong, and that's something that faith communities bring to the debate that that raw politics can't.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned explicitly the Anglican Church as being involved in environmental causes. What other religious communities are you aware of that we would, let's say, put on the pro-environmental or sort of sympathetic to the environment landscape?
Well, there's a synagogue in North York that is rebuilding. Actually, they're building a new synagogue for themselves, and they've taken environmentalism to heart in this, in how they are putting the building together, in terms of lights that turn off automatically when a room isn't being used, insulation. They're going to paint the roof white with a special coating that'll prevent the heat from reflecting back up and warming up the area.
Sort of looking at their own space of worship as a place to deal with the environmental issues.
Exactly, and a chance to sort of they interpret their own faith as requiring that they help out the environment, and so it only makes sense to do this through the building where you do your worship. Catholic Church St. Gabriel's has done the same thing, rebuilt and remodeled. There's another church, I think in the Hamilton area, that decided to heat through thermal heat, which is where you send water down into the earth core and then it heats up and then you bring it back up to heat your building. And to just reach, from their perspective, to reach down into creation itself and heat your house of worship. I mean, there couldn't be anything more sort of faith-based than that, I think.
Unfortunately, we have to take a break for a commercial, but we'll definitely continue this conversation when we return. That was Stuart Laidlaw, faith and ethics reporter at the Toronto Star. Next on 3D Dialogue, we'll continue this interesting conversation. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. I'm Jesse Hirsh, and I'm in studio with Stuart Laidlaw, faith and ethics reporter from the Toronto Star. Now, before the break, we were talking a bit more about how individual churches were retrofitting their houses of worship to reflect the new environmental sensibility. But I'm curious also about some of the theological links behind the involvement in the environmental movement. Can you describe perhaps some of the motivation from a philosophical or theological level as to why people are concerned about the environment?
Well, part of it is is a social justice. There's sort of two parts to it. One is micro and one's more macro. The micro is the social justice we talked about, that some people benefit from the environmental degradation in terms of the profits that are generated, that sort of thing, but that others are hurt more by it disproportionately, and those would tend to be poor people or people in developing countries, that sort of thing. And that's the social justice side of it. The other side has to do more with creationism and the idea that all faiths sort of believe that their God or gods created the earth and that man was given dominion over the earth. And there's been a bit of a reinterpretation of what dominion means, or an ongoing reinterpretation, I should say. Shouldn't suggest it's been decided, but the idea, rather than dominion meaning that man has control and the right or the responsibility to do with it what he will, that man has a responsibility to care for creation on God's behalf, and that's our role on earth.
Almost as a stewardship.
A stewardship thing, as opposed to a controlling of it or a takeover, that sort of thing. The original interpretation of dominion as being the right to control and to bend it to our needs is sort of what helped unleash the Industrial Revolution. To take all the resources of the earth and use them to man's need was seen as an interpretation of dominion. And the reinterpretation, which is the stewardship idea, is that we have a responsibility to care for creation, and that's where the much of the motivation behind being involved in global warming issues, for instance, comes from.
And sort of recognizing on the one hand that we have a responsibility to preserve that which God gave us, but on the other, that we also shouldn't be destroying it as actively as we have been.
Exactly, and that we are sort of, the idea of this reinterpretation of dominion is that you're dishonoring God by destroying creation. It's certainly not a universally held view. I mean,
well, maybe we should talk. I mean, obviously, it's wrong for us to assume that there is consensus, let's say, amongst all religions when it comes to the environmental movement. What are some of the opposing or contrary views that don't see the environmental movement in such a positive light?
The most radical would be the rapturous, well, I shouldn't say very popular, most popular in the United States. It's not a huge movement, but it's there, it's very vocal.
Well, and while not huge, certainly from a Canadian perspective, seems to have a lot of political influence.
Yeah, I mean, the old joke is that there aren't very many rapturous, but they all work at the White House. And the idea is that behind rapturous or end-time ministries is that all good people will be called to heaven, and the rest of us will be left here to endure God's wrath for 7 years. It's sort of as a cleansing almost. The extreme rapturist view on the environment is that there is no need to do anything about global warming or to take care of the environment, since it's all going to be wiped out in this 7 year anyway. So that's a fairly extreme view, and as you say, there's rarely consensus on anything. And one of the things about covering religion is that no matter what somebody says, you can always respond with yes, but. And so the obvious response to the rapturist idea that there is no need to do anything about the environment is, yes, but would God really look favorably on somebody who destroyed his creation? So it's an ongoing.
I mean, to play the other end, but perhaps their perspective is not even one that we don't have to do anything about it because we're all going to heaven anyway, but even not be able to recognize man's role in its destruction. Perhaps they're thinking that God is destroying the environment in lead up to the rapture to punish humanity for not following his word. Do you think that's a stretch, or?
No, actually, I spoke with Anne Graham Lotz, Billy Graham's daughter, when she was coming through Toronto. She came through a couple of times this year, and I talked to her about some of the things that seem to be a reflection of global warming. Hurricane Katrina and floods and all sorts of environmental disasters around the world. And her interpretation was that not that God was causing these things to punish, a world gone bad, but that God would, in the past, put his hand up to stop these things, and that he's not so much putting up his hand anymore.
Right.
So it's not the idea of God, throwing lightning bolts from heaven, as the traditional view, but more that God's not stopping the lightning bolts anymore.
One final question, if I could sort of migrate us a little towards the political. Certainly the religious right has been very notorious in their ability to translate into electoral and political success. If I were the religious left, it sounds, is very active in the environmental movement from our conversation. Do you think there's an opportunity for that to be translated into political power, to be able to affect the type of environmental change on a national and a multinational level, the way that the right have enacted educational change in their own worldview?
There is some potential there, and in the United States, there is an active group trying to bring politics and faith on the left together again. And certainly there's an argument that the Democratic Party was never more powerful than when Martin Luther King was around, and obviously he was approaching politics from a faith perspective from the left. And the New Democratic Party here in Canada has recently set up a faith and social justice caucus to examine this intersect between faith and the issues that the left traditionally goes for. I think, however, the biggest hurdle they'll have, I think, is that the faith groups on the left tend to be a little bit more hesitant than those on the right in making that practical connection.
Perhaps because of their critique of power and the influence of power in the first place.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for joining us today. It's been quite an interesting discussion.
It was my pleasure.
We hope to have you back. Thank you.
Great.
That was Stuart Laidlaw, faith and ethics reporter at the Toronto Star. Next on 3D Dialogue, the concept of heaven from a Christian perspective. We'll tell you more right after the break. Please stay tuned.